And 3, 2, 1. What's going on, everybody? Alex here. We're going to talk about part 2 of inheritance. If you haven't checked it out already, please go check out my video on inheritance part 1, where I cover the basics. Let's get to it. So what I'm showing you here is a little bit of some things that we've gone over before, which are the concepts about a base class and then a child class. Today, what I want to talk about and focus more on is overriding methods. And then we'll also focus on this as a constructors and a little bit about encapsulation. Okay. So as I noticed, as I noted last video, right, we have employee class, which is my base class. And then anything that inherits from employee is going to be my child class. And I can have multiple children, but you could only have one inherited class, which means that salary employee could only inherit from employee, or any other. If he doesn't want to inherit from employee, he can inherit from another class, but it could only be one way in inheritance. Okay, and then as I told you the previous video, you know that employee inherits from object, right? So any base class that you're writing is always going to inherit from object. So you get some methods for free once you create your own class. So what is overriding? So overriding a method means that you're basically going to get a base class method and rewrite it to cater to your own needs. There are a couple of rules when you do that. Number one, and we'll go into more in terms of some restrictions, but you got to make sure it's public. When let's say salary employee wants to override a method on the employee class, that method has to be public. That method has to be public. If it's private, then remember, salary employee cannot see anything that's private from employee. So that's a one restriction. And then the other restriction is that if you have a method, anything that's final. So I'm gonna draw here. I'm gonna put no. Okay. So you cannot override a method if it's private. And if you add final to your method, that as well cannot be redefined or overridden. That indicates that the class cannot be used to be overridden. Okay, so if salary employee is looking back, okay, I'm gonna put little eyes here. It's looking up, right? That's a bad drawing, but so if salary employee is looking up at anything that it wants to override from employee, it cannot look at anything that's private or marked as final. So I'll give you an example as always, right? So let's say that employee class has a method called, let's do public. Oops. I'll just do void, and then do stuff. So let's assume this method is defined in the base class. Now it's public, so the access modifier itself is not part of this no box, right? So that means that anybody that inherits from employee is able to override this do stuff method. Salary employee will inherit from, if I inherit from employee, and I can override. So what does that mean again? I can redefine, okay, so I can do public void do stuff. And whenever I have an instance of the salary employee class and I call this do stuff method, it's not going to call the method that's on the base class. It's going to call the method that is on the child class, as long as you declare a salary employee object. If I did not override this method, do stuff, then if I declare an instance of salary employee and I call do stuff, then the base class method will get called. Okay, so let's say, again, let me repeat that so that you don't get confused. So let's say salary employee did not have this method here, right? We didn't override it. And I wanted to call that do stuff method. If I create an instance, okay, so let's do something here. So when I say an instance, let's say I do salary employee. Just call it s is equal to new salary employee. If I call s dot do stuff, I just told you that we didn't override it in this particular case. So this do stuff is going to come from the employee class, the base class. Because again, we're inheriting from employee. Now, if I did have an overridden method in my salary class, so we'll do that, and I overrode it, okay, then anybody that creates an instance of salary employee is not going to get the base method, but they're going to get the derived method, which is public do stuff, and then this will be my own implementation. Now, when you derive a method or override a method, data types have to be the same. They must be the same. Okay? So you can't change them unless, and this is the little bit of a kind of a new thing, you use something called a covariant return type. Okay. Now, I don't know if I should go over that. Yeah, I'll go over it real quick. Okay. So covariant return type. That means that I'm going to need more paper here. So let's say that you have something like public employee. Oh, sorry. And get emp. And I don't know, you have an ID or something, int ID, right? This is defined inside a base class, so we can say that public class, and we'll call this, we'll keep our example simple, right? So class employee. Okay. So this is my base class, and then we have a salary employee. Okay, so we'll say public class salary employee extends employee. Perfect. Right? I choose to override my get employee method from the employee class. Okay, so I'm going to override it. And here's where the tricky part comes. So public salary employee get emp int id. Okay, so this get emp has an overridden method. Okay, so this method is overridden by this, right? Take this out. But remember I said you can't change types, but you can change class return types as long as you're using the derived class type. Okay, so remember, a salary employee is still an employee because it inherits from employee. So if I do this, what I'm doing in terms of overriding, I technically did change the return type, but because salary employee is an employee, I really didn't. It's still deep down inside, it's an employee, right? It just has new functionality as a salary employee. But that's what we call a covariant return type, okay? And this is, I believe, in Java version 5. Okay, so you can do that. You can do that. You don't have to. You can stick with just public employee get emp and keep the data types the same. But you might as well just do it because let's say you want some functionality that's inside salary employee and you've written some additional methods. You don't want to return an employee, a salary employee at least, and not have those methods accessible to you. Okay, so this is the only time where you can change the data type. Okay, and in this case, you're changing really the reference type, but again, salary employee is considered an employee, so you can't do that. So again, you're redefining the method, and then you'll have your own definition for that method. Okay, so good. I hope that clarifies things in terms of inheritance and overriding. There's another caveat to this, which I did kind of mention in the video, and I didn't want to confuse you, but you could make this private, and you're able to override the method setEmp even though it's private, and as long as you make it public. You can't change permissions to a more restrictive permission in the derived class, meaning that if let's see if I can go back, let's undo, let's do that. Okay, let's say that was public and then I made this private. I can't do that because I'm going from a less restrictive to a most restrictive, and that's not allowed. Okay, that's not allowed. Let's take a look at some code and then we can stop here at this point, and then I'll continue on with the difference between overriding and overloading, and then constructors. And we'll continue with encapsulation as well. Just talk a little bit about encapsulation. Let me bring this over here. Okay. Okay, so in this example, I have my employee class, right? And this employee class is simple. Simple class has a name, a date, and it has getter and setter methods here. And then I have one method which I've made private called getEmployee. So when I return this means this object, meaning this whole object. Okay, you're returning an instance of this whole object, the current object which was instantiated. I'm just returning that. Now, whatever ID is passed, it doesn't really matter. I just made it so you have a parameter there. So this is my getEmployee method. Now, if I go to salary employee, and notice how my access modifier is private. My salary employee, again, get employee parameter, and then now I made this, instead of returning an employee, I made it salary employee, and it'll return this object of this class, which in turn will be just the salary employee object, right? So this is an overridden method. This is an overridden method, and that's perfectly fine. That's what I told you about like a couple minutes ago, which is covariant return type. Okay, so again, I'm going from private to public, and that's perfectly okay. But if employee class had a public and then salary class had a private, that's not allowed. So if we go here, let's take this thing out. What I've done is I've created a salary employee object, John, his hire date, and then the salary. Then I'm going to get an instance of employee, and now it's going to be stored in another reference variable called SE2, which is still a salary employee. So the minute I call this get employee, which one do you think it's going to call? Is it going to call the employee one or the salary employee one? Now remember, we overrode it in salary employee, so if you said the salary employee one, that's correct. So we're going to get the get employee method from the salary employee. And then if I call the get name method, this method actually is coming from employee, because everything that salary employee has is inherited from employee. So notice how I have don't have a get name method here, but I'm extending employee, which means that I have my methods available such as get name. Okay, so as I run this, you have John, right? Because that's what this initially was, my object that I created with SE. Now here's a question that I would like you to ponder, and I'm not going to give you the answer until the next video. What if SE2, I have an instance of the employee, right? Salary employee. I changed the name to Billy, right? So I'm using employees, the employee base class method, right? That's usual, right? I'm printing out get name, so you'd expect this one to be Billy, right? But what about the original object I created here, SE? So if I call SE get name, will that still be John, or will it be Billy? So I'd like you to ponder that question, and we can explain that on our next video.